Stock markets are wrestling with more dizzying volatility. Most Asian stocks have been trading lower throughout the day after Thursday's tumble on Wall Street. The Nikkei in Tokyo closed nearly 4% lower. It's a reversal of much of the historic gains made a day earlier. Investors and markets are trying to digest US President Donald Trump's decision to suspend some tariffs while escalating a trade war with China.
Confusion reigns. Global stock markets are on a nail-biting ride, swinging from gloom to euphoria and back to anxiety about a worsening US-China trade war. Asian markets slumped on opening. Tokyo's Nikkei index fell 5% early on, while Korea's stock index was down sharply. Traders were rattled by massive reversals in Trump's tariff policies, triggering uncertainty that economists warn can paralyze consumers and businesses. Trump's sudden decision Wednesday to freeze most of his hefty new tariffs for 90 days brought temporary relief to battered markets. Then the White House said US tariffs on China stood at 145%, more than the 125% levy that had been widely reported earlier. Wall Street's stocks resumed their freefall, shedding much of the historic gains of the day before.
Markets are reflecting, one, some major exhaustion, and two, just what they're hearing in the news, which is somewhat good to hear in the moment you hear it, but long-term not adding to actual stability.
While the trade war with China intensifies, Trump continues to tease the prospect of a deal with the world's second biggest economy, again emphasizing his close ties to China's supreme leader, Xi Jinping. Analysts believe a deal with China is inevitable, but it will involve a monumental realignment of relations between the world's two biggest economies. And tariffs are not likely to go away anytime soon.
Well, a little earlier, I spoke with DW East Asia correspondent Melissa Chan in Taipei, and I asked her how regular consumers in China have been reacting to the tariffs.
Well, look, people in China understand that their economy is also in bad shape and that none of this is going to help anybody, whether it's consumers in the United States or consumers in China. Having said that, there is a lot of nationalism right now. People do not perceive what President Donald Trump has done as anything but aggressive and pretty awful. And they've been really unhappy, especially online, about what Vice President J.D. Vance said earlier this week, saying that China is everybody there are peasants. So that's kind of been the tone and vibe, is the fighting spirit of the Chinese. And one sick burn, you can call it, if I may, that I've seen is that they're pointing out that U.S. President Donald Trump is starting a trade war when Americans can't even buy eggs.
Right. Now, has there been any indication that there will be further action from the Chinese government?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, China has been preparing a toolkit of ways it can respond because President Trump, during his first term, had already slapped tariffs on China. At that time, it had taken Beijing by surprise. But they've spent the last few years methodically coming up with ways they can make America hurt. For example, the tariffs that the Chinese have levied for American exports means that soybean farmers in many parts of America that support U.S. President Donald Trump, they are very worried because the American farmers export to China soybeans. The soybean used for feed for pigs in China because Chinese consumers eat so much pork. So this is the kind of place where Beijing has been really good at targeting, frankly, red states in ways where they know that they can put pressure on U.S. President Donald Trump.
Now, Melissa, it's just been announced that Chinese President Xi Jinping is heading to Southeast Asia next week. Is this trip connected in any way to the current trade war?
Well, no trip by Xi Jinping is done in haste. So it is very likely that talk about this trip and planning for this trip has been going on for some time prior to U.S. President Donald Trump's tariff wars. Having said that, it's unclear if they've moved forward the date of this trip. And certainly in the context in which this is happening, here you have President Xi going to Southeast Asia. He doesn't travel that much. Usually it's other countries going to visit Beijing, but he is reaching out to Southeast Asia, a figure of stability and calm in the midst of all this, and saying, hey, China is open for business. China is ready to trade with Southeast Asia. And that's the message he's sending.
Thanks, Melissa. We'll leave it there. DW East Asia correspondent Melissa Chan in Taipei for us. Well, meanwhile, Donald Trump has called the EU's decision to pause retaliatory tariffs against the US, quote, very smart. At a cabinet meeting, Trump also outlined how he will approach trade negotiations with the European Union.
We're looking at it as one bloc. They've been very tough, but they were very smart. They were ready to announce retaliation, and then they heard about what we did with respect to China and others, but China. And they said, you know, we're going to hold back a little bit. They decided to hold back. I thought they were very smart. Look, the EU is very smart, but they really have taken advantage of the United States. They were formed for the purpose of taking advantage of the United States.
All right, well, here with me in the studio is Stephen Beardsley from DW Business. You were laughing there, Stephen, because, of course, Donald Trump doesn't often say that the European Union is very smart, or if at all. He also said that they really have taken advantage of the United States, where we were used to hearing that more often. Sure. What do you make of his comments? Is this part of his strategy, his overall strategy?
Pablo, you know as well as I do, it's hard to know what Donald Trump's strategy really is. And he often riffs on things like this. He often portrays his enemies as being smart, to portray them as being cunning as well. And this idea that the EU was formed to take advantage of the US, of course, is nonsense. You know, I can't tell you Trump's strategy, and especially given the last week, I'm not sure that he really knows it right now, because so many factors are changing that really his approach to negotiations with the EU could depend on negotiations with China, whether he needs a quick win, whether he needs to really rain down some pain on someone to make up for going lighter on someone else. It's too early to really say. What we do know is that if you look at the case that his administration has made for improving trade with the EU, this is important. It's not just about tariff numbers, because actually the average tariff numbers between the two sides are pretty close. And if you zero those out, it probably wouldn't cause too much pain. There would be some consternation. Instead, the point that the U.S. likes to make is that there are other trade barriers, including product standards and regulations. That is really the biggest one, in fact. That's what sets them apart. So, and the fact that you said there's a trade deficit, obviously. So how is the EU going to get out of this? Is it going to have to change some of those standards? For example, things like hormones for meat, things like chemicals going into certain products. That's very unlikely, actually. And one of the ones that has recently passed, really focusing on digital markets, digital services, that's aiming at taming in big tech. That's also something they're very loath to try and change. But we know from hearing Mark Zuckerberg, from seeing how tech is talking with Trump, that that's a big focus for them when it comes to the EU. So will Trump take up that banner for them when he goes to the EU, or will he just want a quick win? This is the question that we don't know.
Right, yeah, obviously we don't know that yet. But going back to sticking with the EU and looking at it from now the EU's perspective, you've touched on it there. What course of action is the EU taking to deal with the tariffs in general?
Well, we know that negotiating on behalf of the EU, 27 different economies, is actually really difficult, right? So it takes a lot of time. They have to consult. We know that the first proactive decision they've taken is to set aside these counter tariffs for the time being and to open up negotiations again. That's the position they're in. What we don't know is what April 17th, the first day of negotiations with Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni, we don't know what that's going to look like or what the situation on the ground is going to look like. We've seen what's happened over the past week alone. Who knows where we're going to be by then? The EU probably wants to go for a quick win. If they can promise to buy more products from the US to try and satisfy those trade deficit concerns, that would be a quick win for them. Say, natural gas. That might be an obvious one. The US wants to sell natural gas to the EU. Another option could be, again, taking care of those tariffs. If it can lower tariff amounts, that wouldn't be too painful. The question, again, is it really going to go towards these product standards and regulations? That's going to open up a can of worms domestically in the EU that's going to be really difficult. That's why a free trade agreement between the US and the EU to this point has not worked out. And not just because of the US side, but because free trade is a really difficult sell right now in the EU. Especially farmers are very skeptical about anyone coming into their market. So that's where they're probably going to want to draw the line.
Now, zooming out further, How will all this volatility affect global markets? Because as we know, it's so important to have stability in business, right?
We're seeing it right now. We're seeing it right now. You've seen it as well as I have, right? These roller coaster rides of stock markets right now. What's interesting is watching the panic in the dollar, because that really suggests that Trump has put himself in a difficult negotiating position. He has pushed himself to the limits of what the U.S. market can take. If confidence in the dollar starts to fall, if confidence in U.S. debt, if take-up of U.S. debt starts to fall, people are selling it off, that suggests that confidence in the dollar is going down, and that's a really big issue for a country that constantly needs debt because it runs so many deficits. And so he's at a pain threshold that he may not be able to cross right now. What does that mean for negotiations going forward? That's a really big question. Any pain on China will affect the global markets around the world. That's clear. And Europe, of course, has a vested interest in China having a healthy economy. So all of this is interconnected. Everyone's going to be watching what happens with China.
Busy week for you, Stephen. All right,
For sure.
Leave it there. DW Business's Stephen Beardsley, thanks.